Hello and welcome to the Undressing the Spirit podcast, where sex and spirit go hand in hand. Join me, Tamara Powell, on a no-holds-barred adventure into the psyche and beyond every conceivable limit. Welcome back to Undressing the Spirit. I am so honored that you are here with me today. You know what? I realized this morning that this episode marks the start of the 5th month of Undressing the Spirit. Man, time is flying. I seriously hope that you have been enjoying it as much as I have, looking back and watching the evolution of these episodes as I continue to strive to help unpack what brings mankind meaning and purpose and passion in all the ways has just been so incredibly fulfilling. And I really thank you for your comments and your interactions with me, which, speaking of, I want to give a shout out to Tamika, who left me this voice message on SpeakPipe about a book recommendation. Here's what she says.
Hi, Tamara. It's Tamika here. I'm a master's student for mental health counseling right now. Just wanted to know if there is any one favorite or really just a book or text that you use for studies to gain your credentials that you absolutely will reference or use in your practices. I'd really love to hear what you have to say or what your actual uses are for text that have made an impact on your work as a mental health professional. Thank you.
So thanks for the message, Tamika. I would actually recommend, of course, being a strong existentialist, The Gift of Therapy, an open letter to a new generation of therapists and their patients by the incredible Irvin Yalom. That book changed my life, changed the way I see clients, or maybe not changed it, but more so like reinforced it and validated it. Like reading that book, I was like, yes, we need more of this. Another one, I'm going to do you one better and say that I also loved Grace Unfolding, Psychotherapy in the Spirit of the Tao Te Ching by Greg Johansson and Ronald Kurtz. While that one certainly has some Eastern flavorings, I will tell you it is an amazing dovetailed fit with The Gift of Therapy. That book was just so beautiful to me in the way that it describes the relationship between us as clinicians and those who come to share sacred space with us. So even if you are not into Buddhism or Taoism or anything like that, I highly recommend Grace Unfolding as a really sweet-natured way of taking a look at that incredible sacred space between us and our clients. Now, if you are asking about actual like therapeutic skills, because I am really into internal family systems theory, I highly recommend Parts Work by Tom Holmes. That book breaks down so incredibly with an awesome illustrations done by an art therapist, all of the many different sides of a psyche that can pop up. And yeah, what can I say? I'm a huge IFS girl. I'm also really, really big on choice theory and reality therapy. So anything on reality therapy by Dr. Glasser and Robert Wobbelding is a super cool way of really empowering our clients to take control over their choices. So I hope that helps, Tamika. Thank you again for leaving me a message. And if you want to interact with me and potentially even have your voice message heard on the podcast, head on over to ariatherapy.com. That's spelled ARYA, and click on the little gray icon on the right-hand side of your screen to leave me a voice message. And now on to today's episode featuring the one, the only, the incomparable Marisa Goudy. Marisa is a magic maker, story healer, and writing coach who helps therapists, healers, and transformation professionals tell their stories and shape meaningful messages. With 2 degrees in Irish Lit, nearly 20 years as a Reiki master, and a decade of mystery school training, Marisa infuses the wisdom of Celtic myth and energy healing into all of her work, even when her copywriting clients don't know it. She uses her sovereign storytelling method to help you understand how stories shape relationships and relationships shape stories. You can find Marisa's writing and her writing coaching support and her story healing sessions at marisagoudy.com. And when you're there, be sure to check out her podcast called The Practice of Being Seen with Rebecca Wong. I have binge listened to all of them, and I gotta tell you, it is rare that I do not feel a complete total body swoon. Marisa has this way with words that, she is definitely in the perfect industry for her, but her way with words will have you thinking about subtle nuances that I don't think you will have picked up on before. So without further ado, I give you Marisa Goudy. Hey, Marisa, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
I am so super excited about this podversation. I first came across you, I actually think it was through one of the storytelling pieces, through one of your pieces of writing, and just fell in love.
Oh, thank you. I remember when you started kind of blipping on my radar of like, hey, this lady, she found me. And then I found you back and I'm like, oh, trapezoids.
Yes. Even that right there just makes me kind of gush on the universe. And then I found you back. And that's just so juicy.
Well, it's a pretty rare thing for me to allow myself a non-business community on Facebook, especially. I'm on there for work and I'm trying my best to ease myself out of there in general, being on the social media webs. And, but your community was just special and it drew me in because it fed me at a level that I really needed. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
That just makes my heart sing, seriously. I think for those of us who are online entrepreneurs, it's important to be so almost territorial of our online space and how much white noise we allow into our lives on the daily. And it can be tricky not to end up in just yet another echo chamber.
Mm-hmm. And figuring out that balance between that conscious consuming and marinating in other people's energy and knowing okay, I'm also here to produce and create. How do I find the balance and the right reciprocity so that, I'm showing up in this space in a way that feels healthy and whole and feeds me at some level, even if it's held within a screen that's, 4 inches by 3 inches.
True story. Oh my goodness. Speaking of story, that's exactly what I want to dive into with you today. And not only just story, but the magical alchemy with the whole sovereignty goddess aspect of it that you are just brilliant at.
Oh, thank you. It's such a treat to be able to trot out the sovereignty goddess stuff. I lead with story so much of the time. That's where, my quote unquote real work is. And, meanwhile, the sovereignty goddess is just tugging at my sleeve and saying sister, it's been 20 years. It's time to start telling my story. Let's do this now. Okay.
Yes, let's do that. So for those listening who have no idea who the sovereignty goddess is, give us a brief overview.
Yeah. So she's a figure out of Celtic myth. And so you'll see her across the legends of King Arthur. You'll see her throughout Irish myth, which is my real focus. And she is a beautifully complex character. And I think that's one of the reasons why she's so important and relevant to us. Mm-hmm. She's the embodiment of the land. We hear this idea of Mother Earth, right? So this is a common theme. And this is where they took this in the British Isles and in Celtic countries. They took this to this idea that the sovereignty goddess was the essence of the land itself, but she was also a woman. She was a divine being who would come to life. And in order for a man to become king, he had to lie with and please the sovereignty goddess. So there's a really awesome, like, sacred marriage, sacred sexuality element to this.
I just love, I got to pause you right there. The fact that you just said, and he has to please her. That just makes my feminist so excited. My sacred feminine was like, yes, you do. Yes, come, Yeah,
well, I mean, because ultimately she is the one who bestows sovereignty upon the king, right? Because so think about this word sovereignty. We know it from, newscasts, and we know it from thinking about the creation of countries and nations. And so this is like the roots of that. So you're thinking about the sovereign is the king of the land, but it's the sovereignty goddess that bestows the kingship.
Yes.
And it's a really interesting piece right there, though, in that she is this amazingly important figure, because without her, he is nothing, right? But what happens after he becomes king? Her role is a little less primary. And how does she find her place? And there's some interesting texture in there that I really love to dive into, because I think some of that gets called up in how we might get lost in our unions and in our marriages. And how do we still stay sovereign even after that big act we had to do was finished, whether it's getting married, having kids? How do we continue to stay sovereign? So probably getting ahead of myself, but these are the things that draw me to her, besides, the Celtic mist aspect, all of it. And just, you can go and imagine yourself standing on a green grassy hill surrounded by standing stones. And that's the same magic we're talking about, right?
Yes. And I have a love affair with mist. Always have. Like, I just feel like that's like the place where the veil gets thinned,
Yeah. And she lives in those places. She lives in those places inside of us, right? So I've been working with the sovereignty goddess for years, in that I studied her in college. I have a couple degrees in Irish literature. I was always pulled to her. People have written stories and poems about her for 1,000 years.
I love how you just gloss over that. I have a couple degrees in Irish lit, like, even that about you is so flippin' amazing. Like, who says that? I just, have a couple degrees in Irish lit. Now, you're from the United States?
I am. Yeah. I grew up in Cape Cod, went to school in Boston, and then went abroad to study in Ireland my junior year in Galway. And
why? How did you get drawn there?
Tom Cruise.
Shut up. Now there's a good story, I'm guessing. What?
Yeah. So remember Far and Away? Probably.
My favorite.
Yes. Yeah. I was like 13 and just fell in love. And like, I was one of those kids who just hated middle school and just didn't do well there at all. But thank God when Far and Away came out on VHS, I could just stay home from school for a week at a time and watch it over and over and over again. And my grandfather was dying of cancer, so my mom just kind of didn't notice that I was home, and I was still getting A's. And, I was fine. I had Tom Cruise. He was taking care of me. And it planted a seed that, my family has Irish heritage, but it was never particularly important to anybody until me. I kind of brought everybody into this. And, it would end up that my entire family would go out to Irish sessions and music sessions and drink Guinness together in a way they never would have before if I hadn't discovered Far and Away. Because that then led to, it was the 90s too. So this was like, imagine when Riverdance was coming out and Celtic knots were so cool. Like it was, I was born at the perfect time, even if I wasn't born in the perfect place.
Yes.
But if I had been born in Ireland, I wouldn't have given a damn at all anyway. It was because
I just love that. I really have to honor you for this, because I think this is so empowering for our listeners, is that diving into our personal story and linking that with our ancestral story and really finding ourselves kind of in those genealogy pages. Like, you and I seriously could be soul sisters from another mister, because I was also the first one to really dive into my Celtic ancestry. I always knew we were Scotch-Irish, but it was just kind of like this, almost like an adjective that was thrown in around the family table. It didn't hold a whole lot of meaning. You could have also just been saying that we were white or from a, Christian background, like,
Right.
And we're Scotch Irish. And I have to also point out, like in that movie, when Nicole Kidman lifts the bowl off of him, that is forever burned. I would like replay that. I felt so mischievous and naughty. And yet
What might actually be under
I know. I didn't know at that age, right? Because I was also in middle school too. So there's also that whole sacred awakening that happened too. Funny. And so hearing you as this descendant living over here in modern United States and stumbling across this movie of all things and having this spark come into your imagination, which then led you on this path. And now fast forward some 20 years and you are using this in your daily existence.
Yeah, because, I kind of forgot about the whole Irish degrees thing. I came back with a master's degree. It was right after 9/11. Life seemed messy. I needed to get a job to get dental insurance. So, pushed it aside, didn't do the PhD thing and probably suffered from feeling I felt like failure. And so after my daughter was born and after my own mom passed away, I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out okay, what's next? I'm all of a sudden thrown into being the matriarch of my family. And I didn't ask for this job. I'm 31 years old. And this phrase came to me in just like a download one day. And it was free the princess, crown the queen, become the wise woman.
Whoa.
And I wrote it down and I started trying to talk about it. And my words would just tangle up. And I didn't know how to hold that. But it was this phrase that I knew was really, really important. And I kind of tucked it away and hoped that I'd get back to this idea of free the princess, crown the queen. There's something in there. And then shortly after, I was at my mystery school. I have been attending for 10 years. And my teacher, who's in so many ways my spiritual mother, comes out with a phrase, we're all trying to become sovereign in our own reality. And I don't think it was an immediate thing. It was immediate that I picked up on that phrase. And I just said that. And it reminded me of the sovereignty goddess I had, for the most part, forgotten. And then over time, as, second daughter was born, as I moved through grief, as I developed a business, as I grew up in so many ways, I started to understand more about what this freeing the princess, crowning the queen thing was. And I realized that it was stepping into my own sovereignty.
Wow. And this is the perfect segue because I actually want to read you something that you wrote about sovereignty because I want I'm sure it's weird to hear your own words back to you, but this is what probably made me fall in love with you head over heels. You write, sovereignty is at the heart, personal fulfillment and professional success. When you are sovereign, you are the confident, compassionate ruler of your own life. You don't assume that you can control everything, but you are sure of your worth and guided by your dedication to the greater good. For the healer, therapist, or coach, hello, I'm all three, who wants to change lives with her vision and her work, sovereignty is a beautiful thing to aspire to. Oh my God, Marisa.
Hey, I wrote that.
I know. Hey, you totally did. And it jumped out at me. I thought, yes, that is exactly what we crave when we look towards the goddess archetype.
Yeah, I think being able to stand in a place that I could start to articulate that was just that moment of kind of coming home. I think, so many of us have that feeling of okay, I have this idea and it's just tickling at me and bugging me and it's at the edges of my dreams, and getting it on paper in a way that actually starts to make sense to people. I mean, this is what I do for a living, right? I'm a storytelling coach. I'm a writing coach. Helping people tease things out to that point is really, really hard one. But it in itself is the essence of what sovereignty is, to be able to say I'm standing here in my story and I know it well enough that I can start to tell it to you, and then I can hold you. Because that's a huge part of the sovereignty myth too, is that, we know this idea of the divine feminine as vessel, as cauldron, as container. the sovereignty goddess actually holds a cup and offers it to people. So there's that ability to stand so much in your own truth that then you can hold the truth of others and nurture them so they can find their own truth.
How beautiful. It really is the most, I don't know, oh my God, eloquent description of what we do as healers and therapists and coaches, anyone in this similar helping professions industry. And also as women, as the sacred feminine, in all of our many roles that you talked about. There's just such beautiful overlays there that I'm feeling hearing you describe this, because it requires, I think, a woman to, as you put it, like stand sovereign. I have to know my own truth before I can then hold the container for someone else. And that can be incredibly daunting.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're necessarily trained to get to that point. I think, we talk so much about the hero's journey, and, it's that state of getting from point A to point Z with a lot of interesting adventures in the middle, right? And the huge focus is on the hero and his progression. And, so I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the, Joseph Campbell and what he gave us with the hero's journey, but it's, leaving the ordinary world because of some disruptive event, going through a set of trials, often meeting a magical mentor along the way, ultimately being victorious and bringing the elixir back home to the people. So in a way, there's a bit of the sovereignty goddess contained within there, but that continues to emphasize the hero as the one who does the amazing actions.
Right.
The really interesting alchemical piece of this is that in that journey to becoming sovereignty goddess, to the kind of the ebb of and the flow of the heroine's journey, is that you are leaving, the normal. You're stepping into a wild world. You're going through travails. Hopefully you're meeting mentors along the way. You are getting that magical elixir. And when you bring it home, you become the healer and you become the wise mentor. And that's the real emphasis in this. It's not the great big victory parade when you get back. It's saying, I went out in this great big loop and I looped back into the middle again to help the next people along their journey.
So good. So good. Because I view this kind of as a self-fueling fountain, if you will, where, the sovereignty goddess feeds, comes home with the elixir, holds space for others to kind of awaken, do their magical thing, which then comes full circle to further fuel the power and alchemy of the sovereignty goddess. Like it's, for example, like I keep my own coaches, as apparently, you do too with the mystery school, et cetera. And they hopefully, if they're enlightened, will have space holders for them as well. It's like this beautiful circle of life. But that can only happen when we stand in that sovereign place.
Yeah. And it's about being interconnected. It's not necessarily about being isolated. And, it's an interesting word to be playing with these days, playing with the word sovereign and sovereignty when our current political situation is as it is. There's been a lot of talk of protectionism and, nationalism and very much, closing the borders and putting one particular country first. And, that could be one reading of sovereignty, but instead, we have to look at the way that we're actually so interdependent. And understanding that a sovereign's ability to be successful is that she is supported by those around her. She's supported by other sovereign beings who can support one another. And then when you have that kind of strength, that circle that you're talking about with, coaches and therapists who have their own coaches and therapists and teachers, then you're able to lift those around you who don't have those resources yet. And who may be far from having those resources, or because if you're hearing those little feet outside my office, I've got a 3-year-old who doesn't have the resources yet. So I need to be resourced for her, right?
Right. Yes. And it's also the way that I view my tribe of trapezoids. Not every woman is ready to take that step on her own journey towards going out and getting the elixir and bringing it back to her tribe and village yet. And that's okay. It takes all kinds in the community.
And we're all at different points in the journey, and that's what makes it interesting. I mean, I don't particularly want to be at a community where everyone's arrived.
Right? And yet, I don't know about you, but that seems, if I'm just scrolling through social media, that often seems to be what is portrayed. Even in other, Facebook groups, networking groups, either we're a whole bunch of chiefs and no one wants to be an Indian, or there's the one expert.
Yes.
And no one else gets to contribute to the conversation.
Yes. And that's just, it seems to be such a reflection of being disconnected from our own wisdom and recognizing like, wow, there is so much knowing in this body, in this energy body, and there is so much unknowing in this body and in this energy body. How can I hold and be held? And that's kind of become my credo over the last year, is that I want to hold and be held and understand that reciprocity and flow. And that is, for me, the essence of what it is for me to be sovereign, because I can't do it on my own. That didn't work. That was just burnout. And I can't rely on anybody else fully, because then I'm not stepping into this queen role. Because it was a rude friggin' awakening when I recognized in my early 30s that I was a princess. And I wasn't raised to be that way. I'd had a job since I was 14.
Even that word, since we're playing with words today, has so much stigma to it. Like for me, I'm like, princess. Does that mean she's this bougie, entitled, wench who won't do anything? Or does that mean that she's of royal birth and has a birthright that she needs to ascend to and take on? It really context,
Yeah, and it could be about like apprenticing and training and coming up. And
good point.
Because there's a lot of ways in which, the maiden, the mother, and the crone is that very typical Celtic triad, right?
Now that I get.
Yeah, right. And because the sovereignty goddess has those that triple play in her too, because there's another element to her I didn't mention, is that oftentimes she knows it's the right man who is coming to her because he is willing to embrace her when she's in her hag aspect.
Oh my God, I'm going to cry. Because I really feel like this is what so many women and men, but particularly women at this moment, are craving. And yet we get all these mixed messages from media, from well-meaning caregivers, from even peers. And I see us, you were talking about that ebb and flow, to be held and to, hold. And depending upon the woman and her background and her personality and all the things, I see us struggling with one side or the other, typically, more frequently. So I'm wondering for you, I'm about to put you in the hot seat, which is harder for you on the regular, to hold or to be held?
Oh, I'm a Gemini, so I have to say both.
Are you really? Me too. Shut up.
I think we might be like a week apart.
I know.
Because I think you're 1979, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so am I. I'm born on the 17th. We're like
I'm June 9th.
I can tell by your sign-in name is 6979. I'm like, oh, she's...
Yeah. Yes, for all of you who want to stalk me. Yes. That's wow. And we're both from New England, and we both have a Celtic background. That's trippy. Anyway. So you struggle with both like I do.
Yeah, I think so. Because, in losing my mom when I was 31, my first daughter was 8.5 months old. My mom died suddenly of a heart attack. Nobody saw coming.
So hard.
Yeah. And it just blew life out of the water. And
were you close?
We were born, she was my Gemini twin. I was born on her birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She was my best friend.
Okay.
And, yes, so devastating would be like the smallest word I could possibly use for it.
Yes, total understatement.
She died. I quit work. I quit my job when she died because I'm like, life is too short. If she could drop dead at 60, I can't work in a windowless academic library anymore. Worrying about
what a gift.
Yeah, it really was. In its own ways, it was the world's shittiest gift because I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am now. If not,
in one way, I kind of think it's part of her legacy to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that she was such an amazing mom. She would have made everything feel okay enough that I could have stayed at a job that I hated. That, all my father, my sister, and I all would have made these different choices that wouldn't have been all that positive for us necessarily because we always had her to make it all right, because she would show up with a car full of groceries from Trader Joe's and, bags of clothes for my daughter. And just, this is the kind of woman that my husband considered her his best friend.
Wow.
And so, but she had that mom quality too, she had that balance of being the friend and the mother. And so in missing her, it was that, oh my God, there's nobody here to hold me anymore. I don't have that person anymore. And I certainly know some people never have that kind of relationship with their biological mother or any woman, but having that ripped out of your hands so suddenly, it just, I still feel the vibrations of it every day. And so not having her there, and then all of a sudden being the one who was holding my baby, holding my marriage, holding, my father, my sister, extended family. It was like, wait, like I have to hold all of it, but I'm going to drop it again.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling that constant push pull. And you layer in entrepreneurship and the fact that there's always so much to do and it's never done. It just got into a really nasty cycle of too much and not enough.
Oh, I'm teary. Again, I think this speaks to the power of story and really when we share these, narratives with one another, it provides that connective experience that just transcends. I'm constantly saying words are everything and they're nothing at all. It's what a Gemini thing to say, I know, but I have literally had arguments with my Piscean friends about how language matters. And they're like, no, it doesn't. And eventually we end up agreeing somewhere in the middle that there's power to it. But when I've listened to you and Rebecca's podcast, and definitely going to post links to that in the show notes, that's something that jumped out at me right away, is that what for me gives these narratives meaning is the relational aspect of it that you guys talk about so much.
Yeah. Well, the nature and importance of a story is to connect, right? We all have our stories that we're carrying around within us, and you might call those the lowercase s stories that often are those tapes that are repeating, and those get a bad name, often for a reason, right?
Right.
And then there's the capital S stories. There's the ones that have, whether it's kind of archetypal texture and meaning to them, or whether it's just like, no, I'm going to tell you something that's really true. And my personal story hits something deeply universal within all of us about grief or longing or joy. And those are those, like I said, those capital S stories, that's the currency that I like to trade in, not to in any way diminish those small s stories. I think in the ways in which, Rebecca as therapist and me as writer and storyteller, we balance one another in terms of we need both, and each of us is an expert in one of them. Because I find, being in the world of therapists and talking about being a storyteller, people are like, oh, I don't know. We got to get rid of those stories. Our stories keep us small. I'm like, oh, no, a basic human part of being human. Because the reason why we are who we are as Homo sapiens is that we had an ability to tell stories. Have you heard you've heard this, right?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah. So that ability to sit around the fire and pass a story around that could hold a community together was specifically a Homo sapiens trait. Mm-hmm. And the other, semi-humanoid beings around at the same time didn't tell stories. And so they couldn't create a society that could support itself and kind of keep replicating itself and keep larger and larger bands of people together.
Yes, and we all know who won out. And so I'm really going to add some kerosene to this beautiful bonfire that we are building. And I have no problems being the rebel. So, it is what it is. I know I'm going to be wading into hot water with this, but I think it's necessary. I actually think that this is why traditional psychology is slowly waning and why there is such a big push towards the more coaching, healer, outside the box approach. There's a reason that the sovereignty goddess is on the rise. And in my opinion, I'm very biased, but I own it. It's because this whole therapist as expert model disconnects people. It disconnects clients. I can't understand you and learn from you if I can't relate to you. And part of that is through self-disclosure. It's not to make any therapy session about me, but to be able, when a client comes in with a story similar to yours, why shouldn't I be able to shed a tear and say, I too know loss? Yeah. Like, I don't know. I could preach on that one for days.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, and I know it from the kind of the outside perspective and the marketing land of it in certain ways. Because what I do is encourage therapists to tell their stories. And, you know, I hold them in some really uncomfortable spaces in terms of like, well, I can't say this out loud. I can't tell a client this. I'm like, well, let's figure out what's really in this story and we'll find out what pieces we can tell.
Yes.
We don't live in an age anymore of like you open the yellow pages and you look in the section for like the 4 names that are psychologists in your town, right? We're making decisions as 21st century consumers, and it's about connecting to brand and all those other buzzy things, but it's about connecting to the story of the person you're going to see, because now there's 100 choices and you need to know that you resonate with that story. If it's about grief, if it's about, you know, postpartum, whatever it is, like you really want to know you're going to someone who has been there, gets it, has a reason why they're in this field and why they're going to stake a claim for you and your story and why they're going to connect to you.
Yeah. And as a strong existentialist, I think this is why all of the back end research after therapy is done to see, you know, what therapeutic factors cause the transformation. It's always the relationship. Yeah. Well, how does a relationship happen if there's not these connective moments, which, as you put it, we've come full circle, is through story. So drop the mic. I'm just saying. And it's not just about therapists, although I think that's the most personal, vulnerable space one can almost get in, besides being fully nude, maybe with a massage therapist. But even more so because we're showing our inside nudity as well. But this would apply to literally any business. Branding is nothing more than a story, in my opinion. It's show me who you are.
Yeah. And it's developing a relationship through that story, because my work is all based on what I call the story triangle, because again, it all comes back to 3s.
Yes.
And it's about you, the storyteller, sharing something, sharing the story. So that has the plot and the this and the that and the characters. And then it's also the audience. And it's understanding you're always in a 3-way relationship, because you're not telling the story just for the sake of like, I studied here, I achieved this, quack, 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 quack. Nobody cares. Why does it matter? You know, in that, like, what's in it for me? Like, that's what the reader's asking, because they're kind of selfish, but because, you know, they've got limited time and resources. So don't just sell them with an ad. Connect to them with a story. So it's not just like, well, what are you selling me today? It's like, oh, how can you touch my heart? How can you touch my mind? How can you engage me to say like, oh, you stand out because you struck a chord in me and something felt important here.
I love it. And I am totally going to be cheeky and say, really, what I'm hearing you say, Marisa, is that I have permission to be in a professional 3-way with all.
I had a feeling you were going to pick up on that, sister. I really did.
That's because you're also gifted and intuitive as well. So, of course, that's my favorite, because everything I do has a sexy edge to it. That's part of my story. It's mine. Yeah. Yes. So when you talk about the sovereignty goddess, does she ever go by different names for you? Do you ever see her in different incarnations?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories that she comes through, and you know, pretty much any Celtic goddess you can name, she will have aspects of the sovereignty goddess. You know, there's Rhiannon from Wales. There's Bridget, who's, you know, the ultimate Irish goddess in so many ways. There's Caradwyn with her cauldron. And, you know, there's the ones that I love the most are sometimes those which are a little bit twisted and you can't quite tell what's happening and why. So,
such a Gemini aspect.
Exactly. Because I mean, and you know, I remember one of my Irish studies professors said, you know, and I'm not sure if his reasoning was, you know, why you've never seen a decent movie about Irish myth. I think I might have inserted that in later, but he always said Irish myth out weirds the weird.
Yes, we do.
And it's just because it's like, oh, that seemed like a normal story. And whoa, then you just flipped it on its head. So there's one particular goddess who's been coming through for me more and more, and her name is Macha. And depending on what version you read, she might just be a fairy woman who kind of came through the stones. The older stories would have it, no, she's much more than that. They've diminished her down to just a fairy because it was a little too uncomfortable to understand we had a goddess on the loose, right? Mm-hmm. And so she shows up and she takes up residence with one of the local landowners, and they fall in love, and she becomes pregnant. And she said, you and I will be together and happy forever as long as you don't tell anyone about me. And he says, oh, of course, certainly. Then he goes off to the great fair. And, you know, he was a bit of a drinker and a bit of a boaster, you know, so I'm not quite sure what she saw in him, but maybe he was just really good in bed. Mm-hmm. And so in this course of this, the king's horses were racing. And he said, oh, they're all fine and good, but my wife, she can run faster than them. And meanwhile, his wife is in her ninth month of pregnancy. And so, but he boasts, and the king hears it. And he said, well, then bring your wife in here and show this to me. And so she comes, she's an obedient wife of the day. She does what she must do. And she runs against those horses and she beats them. But then she gives birth immediately after to twins. And in this, she actually ends up laying a curse upon the men of Ulster that any time they are in a moment of need right before battle, they are going to go into the birthing pains of a woman for days on end and be unable to fight.
Wow. And are these the Ulster, Scots, Irish people who end up coming to the United States later on?
They would be from the same place. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's my ancestral lineage. I just got chills. Wow.
So, unfortunately, you know, in that case, it's a time when they violated sovereignty and they paid for it. And, you know, this is part of a much bigger story that eventually involves a warrior queen and, you know, a lot more fighting, as Irish myths tend to. Yes. But there's something in that story of Macha that holds a real poignancy to me right now, I think, because we need to look at the shadowy parts of the story and understand the ways in which sovereignty is being violated right now, whether it's how we're treating the earth, whether it's what we're doing politically to people from other nations, like how are we holding what's sacred to us? How are we protecting the people we're meant to be protecting and holding? What happens when we don't?
Right.
And so just the fact that sovereignty carries us through these tough places, and sometimes she's just pissed.
And giving ourselves permission to be righteously indignated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if we don't have those pieces of righteous rage, I think we're missing half of who we are and half of that emotional spectrum, which I admit I'm still dealing with and coming to terms with. I spoke so glowingly of my mother before, and she was a definitely, oh, don't worry, be happy, honey, kind of mom. So this is kind of part of my own process of saying, okay, well, how can I look at both those beautiful and that, you know, crowning the king and everything is wonderful, and now we have great fertility in the land aspects of the story. And how can I look at the parts that say, ooh, she wasn't honored in that case. Maybe in the way, you know, she shouldn't have shown up, and getting to shoulds of what goddesses should and shouldn't do isn't necessarily helpful. But we look at myths from all these angles, right? You know, she went and did something against her will.
And yet, right, in that, I picked up on nuances of warmth in that. To me, it was an act of love, even as it was an act of obedience. She did not, you know, shit on him in that moment. She did not strike out at him, rage at him, embarrass him, emasculate him. She showed up and did what she had to do, so to speak. But what I was feeling about the modern woman and the struggle to reclaim the sacred feminine in her balance, in that, to me, sovereignty holds that duality that us Geminis are so well known for. And I hear women say, well, yeah, I'm a bitch, and this like reclamation, which I support, taking back the word, that's fine. But it almost feels hollow and empty when she says, it just stands for be in total control of herself. And there's this like flippant, like, I don't know, little girl energy, like I'm going to stand here and you better not mess with me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about your experience of it, but it just feels hollow. It's like there should still be this warm groundedness, and that my sovereignty means I so know my truth that I don't have to be reactionary.
Yes. Oh my gosh. First of all, total shivers that you read a whole other element into the myth, because that's why we have these, to see all these facets and sides. Like that's why these stories endure and why they're still interesting. The story's 1,500, 2,000 years old. Mm-hmm. But, when someone is going overboard with claiming her bitch self, sometimes it looks like maybe the princess is trying on the queen's shoes and she's going to fall.
She's not ready. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And not to blame the princess, because we've been her. And, I think we started talking briefly before around that idea of maid, mother, and crone. In my imagining of it, it's, because how the maiden image only serves us for so long in this culture when, there's a long period in which, for many women, we're having sex, but we're not moms yet. So where does that leave us, right? We aren't maidens anymore. And so it's not like the moment of we first have sex and we end up becoming mothers. Mm-hmm. I then see this kind of princess period more as an apprenticeship, as coming into sexuality and understanding it and going through a lot of the shadows of entitlement and I don't know yet. And before arriving at that warm place you were talking about, that's where the queen is. She has that regal energy that holds those around her, that's fully anchored into the earth, that cares for people. And for her, maybe she occasionally claims her bitch self, but it's in defense and protection of herself. Advocacy, yes, those around her. Because she's edging up on the wise woman. Like she's always leaning into that greater place of wisdom that has gone through the struggles, that has done so much of the caregiving, and then will sit and be able to hold the whole cauldron for us.
That's also what the whole cauldron, I'm so glad you said that. That's exactly what I love about the Celtic triple goddess mythology, is it, for me as a woman, lessened the fear of leaning into the crone energy, the sage energy, the old woman energy. And especially in Western society, mourning, it feels like a mourning sometimes of that maiden desirability, arousal that we're told we only have for so long. And then you might get blessed with the role, so quote unquote, of motherhood. But what happens when we're no longer mothering our children at home? To me, the Celtic goddesses were still very sensual, even in their crone energy. There was still this fertile creativity and I think even sexual energy that was timeless. And so for me, part of the story that healed, we're talking about, the healing work of it, was the sovereignty goddess got to be all things at one time, and I didn't have to choose. Does that make sense?
Oh, it completely does, because that's ultimately so much of it is, when I talk about it as a progression, it's a Celtic knot. You just can only say, but you can't say all the words at the same time. So you have to say, free the princess, crown the queen, embody the wise woman, because that's what language does and that's where sentences go. But if you drew it as a picture, it's going to be that treacle, that triple knot where they all kind of keep folding back into the center and keep feeding one another.
And I need a whiskey and a cigarette. Like, I don't even smoke, but someone bring me a cigar and some sherry. This woman.
It just seems important to mention too, because you and I being all of, 8 days apart, I realize how much of this started coming through for me too, in terms of like, what the heck does 37 years old mean right now? like as I'm watching the gray hairs just start to come through, and it's saying, and there's those moments of like, okay, my body's changing, things are shifting. Like I know I'm done having children. What is the great gulf between here and crone? Because I'm pretty sure like I'm excited about being a crone when I'm 70. So there's a long space here, right?
Yes.
And, in some ways, of course, we soften that for ourselves with wise women to understand like,
you picked up on that.
Yeah. But kind of saying like, okay, right now, even as I'm stepping into like, I've got this mother queen energy stuff down, I'm going to pull on the princess every now and again because she knew how to have so much fun. She knew how to have fabulous sex all night long. I'm going to still remember her. And God bless me, I'm bringing her all the way into my crone days.
Hell yes.
Yeah, because we need all those different elements. And I mean, to me, that's just why I feel so held by these three. Like I feel held in the center opposed to necessarily being all one at any time.
I love it. I really do. The diffusion of it at the same time, the inclusion of it is just, so much melty bliss in that. And something else about, while we're on the story of Celtic myth, that really was healing for me, even as an American descendant of it, was growing up in white patriarchal Christianity and trying to find a way to still hold a sacred space for it while allowing for more, for me, was so big in Celtic mythology, and feeling into, you named my favorite two first, Rhiannon and Bridget. For me, Rhiannon gave me permission for my magical side, being known as the sorceress, and Bridget really spoke to the warrior goddess energy that I felt, and she's often thought of as the female archetype to the Archangel Michael, and it was familiar and yet magical at the same time, if that makes any sense. Yeah. And I found that so healing, and I've used that with my clients now of when they, not surprisingly, I work with other trapezoids, people who feel othered somehow, like they're too much for some, not enough for other. And genealogy work has been very powerful in transforming and saying, you may not resonate with the other branches closest to you on your family tree, but if you go back, maybe 4 or 5 generations, you don't even have to go back that far. It's amazing how some of those stories pop up off the page and you can, feel into those misty spaces again. And come home in a new way.
Right. It just feels important to mention this. It's kind of a sidebar, but in the midst of this real like reclaiming and really writing into sovereignty and talking about it in a more overt way, there's also been a lot of really troubling stories coming out of Ireland. The stories of the tomb babies, where they discovered that,
I saw that.
More than 800 babies buried at a convent where mothers and children home. And as this was coming through, I just found myself more tuned in and aware of all those layers of Irish society and Irish history that I didn't necessarily notice when I was living there in my early 20s, because I went there for the magic and the fairies. And, I had stepped away from my Catholic upbringing enough years before that I was willing, because, the Miss of Avalon pulled me out of the church big time when I was 14.
Angelica Houston. What's up? Yes.
I started with the book. But, like there was the Morgan Le Fay and I were in Morgaine. We were I got her. And, that had already tugged me out. So I rode this really probably trapezoid shaped wave of being in Ireland, in 1999 through 2003, and didn't see all that kind of the underneath shadow. Sure. And now it's this kind of feeling like, okay, as I'm maturing into my own story, able to see the whole thing and be able to hold the good and the bad, the shadow and the light, it just adds so much more texture to the place, because you recognize too, in a country that was so Catholic, so Christian, how remarkable it is that these stories have still filtered through to us. They've still been held in the land and held in probably enough women's stories that they've been passed on to us. The monks did their great job with the illuminated manuscripts and all that. But ultimately, the stories that we know that really get us in the gut had to have been carried on through storytelling and given one generation to another until they could start to be written down only a couple hundred years ago.
Oh my goodness. There's two things as we start to wrap up that I have got to highlight about what you just said. And maybe it's the Gemini duality in me. But number one, what I love about the shadow side of that is that it really speaks to a woman's entire essence now. When I hear you describe, the bloody side of these stories, the bloody side of the country that even is today. Lord knows Ireland has been pockmarked from the get-go. Mm-hmm. It actually helps me find I almost want to crawl into the story and cover myself up with it. To me, the darkness in that is also very calming and comforting because it makes me feel less fucking crazy at times, if I'm honest, because I get tired of holding on to the pretty for other people. Yeah. So in many ways, knowing that my ancestors, it just, also went through that. It just breathes that fire back in my veins. Mm-hmm. I like that side in a way. Obviously, it's tragic. It's awful. But knowing that their tragedy gave birth to my tragedy, I don't know. There's healing in that for me.
That long presence of death in life is just, we have to hold. We're human.
Yes. And the second thing that jumped out at me about that is how the Celtic path, to me, is one of inclusion. When I did my research on my genealogy and recognizing that for my pagan side of my ancestors, when Christianity and the other, Islam and some of the other newer faiths were coming along, that they were in many ways welcomed before they were pushed out, before they tried to push our pagan side out. They were like, oh, you worship the goddess Bridget? Let's make her a saint. Right. And there was this hand in hand that at first I'm sure it was a bumpy road that took place between Christianity and the old world. And it saddens me in modern day society. I think we're coming back over again. Yet another reason why the sovereignty goddess is on the rise, I think, is because there's this longing for pluralism, to be able to respect one another's stories and myths and not have to have it just our way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, again, we're remembering that these are filtered through a different culture. We've all filtered these things through to make them mean something to us, but they've retained an essential meaning within. Sovereignty is still sovereignty for all the people it's passed through. And if we could look at it as having enriched the story rather than robbed it of something, then I think we're onto something in terms of why we need this story now and how we can all continue to add to it together.
So good. That is a beautiful space to end on, because I think that adding to the story rather than taking it away is something that even the housewife at home can do with her own stories. Mm-hmm. So good. Thank you so much, Marisa, for your time and your words of wisdom.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's just been so exciting to play in the turf and in the earth of Ireland with you and root it here in our very American lives, because that's the essence of it, right?
Yes. So thank you. I will see you on the interwebs, my dear.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Undressing the Spirit podcast. I pray you found some inspiration and titillation today. As always, I am forever grateful for 5-star reviews, comments, and subscriptions on iTunes and anywhere else you may be listening to this broadcast. Please note the information provided is not meant to convey professional, psychological, or medical advice. If you could use such services, I highly recommend seeking them out from someone you trust. To get in touch with me personally, please check out ariatherapy.com or talesfromatrapezoid.com. Until next time, everyone.